Have you ever wondered what it's like to pursue a career in competitive gaming? Maybe you're thinking, wouldn't it be cool to play games for a living? Well, you're in the right place. Welcome to this Valorant Life podcast, where we dive into all things Valorant. This week's pod, we talk about the untold stories of esports, the sacrifices, and the things that you need to know that can make or break your career. Don't miss out on the first-hand experience of my friend and top Radiant player, Adam, also known as Dopai, as we dive into the world of professional gaming. Let's get into it. So welcome to this Valorant Life podcast, episode 1. I wanted to ask you, Adam, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so people know me as Dopai. I've been kind of competing in the past. Currently, I am a Valorant coach. I make content for it and try to help people learn the game. Previously, before I played Fortnite and CS kind of casually, and also League of Legends. But I made the transition to Valorant from Fortnite when I was a semi-pro. So I have some competitive experience, and then I also have a computer science degree that I'm not using because I'm trying to make it in content.
And my name is Tim. I am not a good Valorant player. I'm improving thanks to Adam's coaching. My background in gaming is I started playing competitive games at the advent of broadband internet in 1996, 97. I started playing CS in beta 5. I played that competitively until 1.6, and then I went to university and real life took over. And since then, I've played Magic the Gathering and League of Legends casually, and more recently Valorant, which is how I got to know Adam. And so, with that, I wanted to jump into our topic today, which is what competing in Valorant is really like. So maybe Adam, I'll start it off with what's the biggest myth or misconception around competing in Valorant?
I think a lot of people expect to make it pretty quickly. I think that they underestimate how the tournament systems are kind of held up. And if you do well, you'll get picked up. I don't think that that's completely true. I think there's a lot of kind of like luck that comes into it.
What do you think teams are actually looking for?
I think teams are kind of just looking for like really star individuals. They're not really looking for quote unquote really developed teams, like a full 5-man roster. They might be looking
Mhm.
for like a strong core or like players that they can pick up and, like, upgrade their team essentially.
So you would say they're kind of like over indexing on individual skill level and minimizing collective team play.
I would say so, yeah. At least from when I played.
And so do you think that's a major oversight or leak on their part? Like orgs today?
Most likely, it's like a difficult industry to do well in, and that's probably why they do it like that because they're looking for players that are also really good but maybe have like a fan base. So that probably plays a big precedent into it as well. It's like not just raw talent or how good your team is, I guess.
Hmm.
So,
And
yeah.
so knowing what you know now, what did you wish you knew before going into competing in Valorant?
There's a lot that I wish I knew. Um, I think the biggest thing is I wish I had built a bigger platform, either while I was competing or before I was competing, to kind of have my name out there. Um, at least taking the content side more seriously, so that my name was on the radar, either to get picked up or to also try to pick up players for my team instead of being a nobody.
So this sounds for something as like objective as uh, being good at Valorant, it sounds like a little bit like a popularity contest.
I think so. There's a lot of ego in Valorant, inside ranked and outside of ranked. So when you're trying to build a team from the ground up, you have to reach out to those players with egos. And if they don't want to build a roster with you, either because they don't think you're good or they don't know you, you're you're gonna struggle. So for a lot of new players out there, they're not going to have quote unquote great players on their team. They kind of just have
Mhm.
to, go through and grind it out and essentially climb the corporate ladder for tournaments and
But
teams.
it sounds to me like there's a lot of actually like maturity issues in terms of like competitive Valorant.
I believe so. At least in my experience, a lot of the players are younger and the older players have already built rosters.
Mm,
So you're looking at to like kind of get players that are either that they think they're too old to play, like just boomers that are kind of just playing for fun, but they like the competitiveness, which, no hate to boomers, they're also really good. And then for like the really young kids, they think that they're better than they are, or they don't want to like integrate into a system of a team. And
mm.
they're a little bit too individualistic. So it is very difficult, I think, to find a 5-man roster.
What would you tell yourself today if you were starting this journey again?
Find core players that you want to play with and focus more on yourself rather than the team. The reason why I say that is because I always put my team first over my individual performance. And I think in the end that potentially bit me in like a bad way, just because maybe I would like play positions that I wouldn't normally play just because one player wasn't comfortable on it, or maybe
Positions
feeling
or roles?
position specifically. I made sure that I was still playing my main role, but at least for the player that I played the most with, my co-IGL, I would say Bobo, he did more than me in sacrificing himself because he was a jet main when we met. And he ended up playing every single role in the game to fill for the team so we could pick up players. So in his case, I think he sacrificed a lot to kind of make the team work when in reality he should have focused on himself.
So what do you mean you played positions? Like what would be an example of that?
Kind of like being the guy that breaks util or maybe being first or second in. I guess being a little bit more selfless as a player. Whereas like if I played a little bit slower, for example, Hiko is kind of known to be like the slower clutch player. And I feel like I wasn't ever alive in those positions because I felt like I had to be going in aggressively and making plays.
Doesn't someone on the team need to do that?
Someone does. I think, though, that with the skill variance, if I was dead, it felt like the
Mm,
round was a lot harder. And not to
mm,
say my teammates weren't good. There were points in time with that roster where I would consider myself probably the worst player on the roster,
mhm, mhm,
but there were also points in time where I would consider myself one of the better players on the roster.
mm.
And because of that fluctuation, it was difficult to kind of figure out who should be going in and the timings and all of that stuff.
It makes me think about team culture a little bit. What was the team culture like? And were you able to have discussions about these things or you weren't?
It definitely changed over the iteration of our rosters. Just thinking back about it or back on it, our first roster was very rookie level and none of us knew what we were doing. So discussions were there, but they weren't very in depth. Like it kind of felt like no one knew what they were doing, so we didn't know what to talk about. Eventually, I would say probably like 6 months after the roster has kind of been formed and we were getting our footing, then like actual team discussions were being made and progress was being made on that foot. But I felt a little bit slow and, you know, if we like made steps in the right direction, but then got confronted with a loss or an obstacle, it kind of felt like we had to talk about it all over again. And it always felt like we were starting back at square one every single month and every single week or every single loss. Like, just felt like we weren't really making progress when going through an uphill battle, even though realistically we probably were making progress. It just felt really slow.
Who was setting team culture?
Most likely, I would say in most teams, it would probably be like the captain or the IGL.
Okay.
In our
Is
team,
captain and the IGL usually the same person?
I don't know. At least for us, I would say it was different because initially I was IGL and I also built the roster, so I was captain. But I realized I couldn't do that. So Bobo ended up taking IGL and we kind of co IGL'd. But with the team culture aspect, I feel like that kind of comes with your core members, like ideally 3 people. And we had, I would say, a healthy culture between our 3 core,
Mhm.
but then fourth and fifth, kind of always felt a little bit out of the loop.
Mm,
And
mm,
then there was also like the kind of like groups that stuck together that would grind after practice, like reviewing stuff. And then there were also players that would group and play together in ranked, and it kind of wasn't like cohesive as five. Like we played together for practice, but then like I guess extracurricular practice or like setting up plans or strats and all that stuff was like in parts, I guess.
sounds like a little like cliquey in a way.
Yeah, and it wasn't intentional in that aspect. It kind of was just, people got along with certain people for different things. Like,
Mhm,
for example, me and Evad, which was our controller player that we picked up from ranked, great player, great guy. Me and him always spent a lot of time after the servers to kind of like, break down VODs and stuff like that, which Bobo, on the other hand, great player, but he was always like more so for ranked and like he would
mhm,
grind ranked and he was always playing ranked for tournaments and stuff like that. So there was definitely like a, you know, disparity there. And I'm not saying
mhm,
there's one way better than the other, but
mhm.
because of that, it kind of felt like there was like a lot of catch up to do either mechanically or
Yeah,
strategically coming to
strategically, yeah.
practice. Yeah.
And so that's where a coach would typically, or like an analyst would like fill that gap for teams
Right.
so that individual players can just play ranked and stay sharp.
Hmm.
Like,
That's, I think, a big problem for tier 3. It kind of feels like a lot of the jobs rely on the players because there's only 5 of us.
mhm,
Whereas like when you're playing against these academy rosters or tier 1, tier 2 teams, they have a full infrastructure to work around. So we have to work like feels like extra time to get it in, but we're always playing catch up regardless. So there's a lot of hours that are getting put into it, and because of the player thing and the ego thing before, it feels like you have to have results before you can actually get more results. It's like an end the cycle kind of.
mm, mm. So what's the typical day like for a player that's trying to make it in Valorant competitively?
So for our team, we made sure to like at least have 3 to 4 scrims and then about a review beforehand. Scrims are always late in the afternoon, so those practice blocks are about 5 to 6 hours.
Okay, let
And
me
then
break you there. A practice block of 5 to 6 hours. In retrospect, do you think that's optimal?
I think so, because I think that if some people only do that practice block, this was also me at some point, it's probably decent to develop in a team setting.
I
But
guess
if
my
you
question is, can you play 6 hours consecutively and really be putting in 100%?
the 6 hours consecutively, no, but
Okay.
we had breaks in between each scrim, and then we would
Okay.
review, so it wasn't just 6 hours back to back. There was
Okay.
definitely, like, some, practice there. But if you're including ranked before, and then you're also including, like, you know, planning out practice for the next day and all that stuff with strats, it can definitely get into probably too many hours. So,
Mhm.
I think there's
Mhm.
an unhealthy balance there, at least for our team.
Would you change anything about that schedule if you were to do it again?
I think the practice schedule is decent. I don't know if I would change anything there, but maybe I would kind of include ranked as part of it and making sure that teammates are forced to play with each other to kind of build chem out of it,
Mm,
and then maybe you can
mm,
bring things into practice. So maybe that would have to be at the cost of 1 or 2 scrims, which I think is fine. But the reason why I think it's okay, and some people might think like 5 to 6 is too much or too little. The hard part with these scrim blocks is because you're trying to get one map really refined.
mhm,
And since there's 7 maps in the pool, your strong maps are going to vary, right?
mhm,
So as you're developing as a team, best of ones will be okay.
mhm,
You'll be able to ban your weak maps, but in a best of 3, that's kind of where your map pool is tested. So
mhm.
that's kind of where we always fell short. I felt like we always had like a solid 2 or 3 maps, but never like enough to make it through best of 3 phases.
So you'd have one good map, they would ban away one of your other good maps, and then you'd have
Mhm.
to play a map that you were less less prepared on.
Right. And, you know, you could go through a map in 1 week and feel really confident on it. And then next week you start on another map, but then you play your map in a tournament again that you thought was a good map, and then you realize you have to make changes. So
How
it's
much is it prep per map? And how much is it good team protocols?
I would say it's like 50-50. Map prep goes a long way, especially on defense. If you have a very little prep on defense, you're just gonna get ran over. They could just 5-man hit your site. So
Because the
have
executes are so coordinated.
right.
The
So you have
the
to
the guy
have
anchoring or the guys trying to stay on site just get run over.
exactly. I remember, and I still remember this match. We were playing against KCP, which was like Kansas City
Mhm.
Pioneers,
With
and we had
Reedage,
like,
right?
yep, and we had like a great defense half on Haven. I want to say like 9-3 or something. Flip halves, they just ran us down because our offense was so prepped that we felt like we were really strong, but we couldn't hold a sight against them.
Mhm.
So that was very demotivating. And I remember that match. That kind of like exploited like how much prep and defense kind of big plays a part, I think.
And so is this like a fundamentally a coach resource thing? Like a team, like an academy team that maybe benefits from an analyst or a coach, or maybe benefits from the analyst coach for the main team. They'll just have more drilled maps and strats prepped than you would as an amateur team without those types of resources.
I think that would be a big part of it. At least at least for us, since we were kind of learning the IGL role. Like I was learning IGL and then Bobo picked up IGL to help me. We didn't have a veteran IGL on our team.
Mhm.
And I think that's probably where the biggest key lies because then they want to approach maps and their system and they have all these things outlined. So I think a coach can help with that. But I think more importantly, having a veteran IGL probably would go longer, like play pay more dividends for the team.
Mhm. Because they will have a particular way of thinking the game,
Hmm.
and that needs to synergize with how the coach and the analyst are supporting that prep.
Right.
That's interesting. What are tournaments like schedule wise?
They're terrible. Typically on the weekend, and they are normally 1-day tournaments, with the exception of Nerd Street, I believe. I think those kind of spammed in the course of 2 days before, but most of them are 1-day tournaments. At least the people call it Mickey Mouse, which is like low price pool.
Yes. A
Yeah,
pejorative term for non-tier 1 tournaments?
yeah. And they would start. I don't remember the exact date. It's been a while, but they would run until like midnight to 2 a.m. if you were making it into
Mhm,
finals.
mhm.
So your sleep schedule's definitely
Trash.
bad. Yeah, trash. You're probably not performing in the finals that late.
And what about scrimbucks? Like, was there a distinct difference you noticed between teams in scrims versus teams in tournaments?
100%. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but there's like a running meme to not scrim against Latam teams, at least when we were competing, because their play style differed from NA so much. And it kind of felt like they were, I don't want to say one step behind, but they were so aggressive to the point that it felt like the strategic part of it wasn't there yet. But I think that's completely changed now. I think Latam's probably, a really solid region. But at the time, that was kind of the appeal. And on top of that, some teams kind of just play scrims to win, especially like newly formed teams. They're like
Mm.
not really practicing strats that they would use in game, or like people are making solo plays and things like that. So they're essentially just looking to get the number 13 on the scrim board if they're not playing out all rounds.
Like, as
Um,
opposed to trying to improve as a team.
Right, like running one strat over and over, practicing their retakes, or
Mm.
just playing something standard. It was just like sometimes they would call strats specifically to counter strat our setup, which is kind of counterintuitive to what scrims should be like, in my opinion.
So, like, scrims are more than, like, almost like a practice container against another team rather than trying to win a match.
Right. Yeah, like regularly in our scrims, we would just run 5-man executes over and over again to
Mm.
try to get util down, pacing down, all of that stuff. And then vice versa, we would either run the same default every round or just like a mix of defaults, but never 5-man hits.
So the scrim box, when you see like a new team scrimming and they take a screenshot of it and one team's winning, one team's losing, they could actually just be spamming the exact same strat over and over again, even though the other team knows it's coming because
Hmm.
they want to practice it. And so the
Right.
score may not have any relevance to actually how the team is gelling or how good they are.
100%.
Okay. That's news to me. Did your team show up in tournaments, you feel like, the way you did in scrims?
It's kind of funny. I think it was some maps that we would consider our worst became our best maps in tournaments, and our best maps that we considered in scrims turned out to be our worst in tournaments. So
How is that possible?
maybe it's because like the systems we had in place were too rigid for the players, or maybe we didn't have enough systems, so like people were confused. Whereas
Mm.
like when we were kind of just free balling a map, we were just playing it loosely and like trusting our teammates or kind of just playing it how we're used to, like in ranked. So there was a lot of, I guess, mix and match there. And there's along with that, there's like a running meme in our team that when we would run a map, we would always change our comp. Like one or two agents would always
That
change.
that does not seem optimal.
No, definitely not. We were trying to innovate the space. At some point, we were playing double controller, Viper on Haven before it was like right now, if we did that, it would be meta.
Mhm.
But we were playing
Back then it
Viper
was
on
not.
Haven, yeah, way before it was meta.
How important are roles?
Probably the most important thing. I think that if you try to fill in roles, your team's not going to get very far, in my experience. Um,
What happens when you try? But didn't I think it was it Turtle Troop that was like 5 jet mains?
I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the roster.
Or Squirtle Squad, I think they made it in as 5 jet mains. Like what happens when you try to force a player in a role into a role that they're not comfortable with?
You kind of like lose discipline or like depth in one's play. Like for example, if you're gonna put a jet player on smokes, you
Mhm.
just limit all of like the creative chaos, and like that's
That
their
that guy
skill set,
creates
right? And
or
like all
girl.
the space,
Yeah.
yeah. So you just like make them a cookie cutter controller, and like now the star capabilities are just like basic controller, watch flank, and
Mm.
they don't really know how to lurk yet because like they're a duelist that makes space on sites. So
Mm.
yeah. It's just like a lot of gaps, I guess.
Would you say though your opinion on that has changed? Did you think people could just pick up different roles before? I mean, that's a lot of initially all the pros coming into Valorant were just from CS. So there's this feeling of like, oh, you just take a cracked CS player and you put them in any role and then you're good.
I think it depends on the player. I think there are players out there that can kind of fill any role. And then I also feel like there are players that just should never be filling roles.
Mm. Who's a
One,
particularly like versatile player that comes to mind for you?
Zekin, I think he's top tier. He could probably play any role in the game, but it would be limiting for him to play controller, in my opinion. Whereas, like, maybe you put tens out there, you think of tens, like, you probably want to limit him to duelist or initiator and keep him away from sentinel or controller.
Because
Um,
that kind of leans into his skill set.
right.
There's a baseball thing where there's like an order that you can move players defensively. So
Mhm.
like you can move an infielder to the outfield because the outfield's considered easier than the infield, but it's one direction. Like you don't move usually outfielders into the infield. Is there like or actually in league, pro ADCs will sometimes move to support. It's like the retirement position for old ADCs, right?
Right.
Does that kind of role order exist in Valorant, you think?
Probably because I personally think controllers and senties have an easier job just because they're not first contact most of the time. So you could probably put a duelist or an initiator player into those roles. But of course, in a team setting, it is completely different. So
Mm.
I think it is hard to say, but it probably doesn't go the other way. You probably don't put, an IGL or a controller player on duelist
To
and
duelist,
expect,
yeah.
yeah. So if there was one way, it would be that way. Duelist and initiator to either controller and sentinel.
So
But
for the record then, one day you think that we might see like a ye old Turka or like a ye old Aspas on Sentinel or controller?
it definitely is possible, yeah.
Okay. Okay. What was winning like? And what was losing like? Like what was this competitive lifestyle like?
Winning is very addicting. When you have a clutch, the team hype is around you, like they're just cheering you on. Like when you win a match or you take like a match like off of a good team, you feel on top of the world. You feel like momentum carries you, and I think momentum is a very real thing. If you take a map off of a really good team in like a the same day tournament, that momentum will probably carry you until the end of the day. Like you're just gonna be playing confident, everything's clicking, you trust your teammates, like there's no doubt, you're making better reads. And then as soon as you lose, it's just the reverse.
So what do you think? Do you think that that mental kind of, so there's momentum, but then you can see teams that feel a little bit like unshakable, right? Like you look at how like Loud's been performing, like they've just been so stable. And even when they're losing, you feel like they're going to win. Do you think that the mental side you can build up individually or as a team?
I think you can build it up through not really culture wise, but like through your performances. And there's probably people who disagree with me with this, but I think your past performances give your team and your players confidence in the current system.
Mm,
Um, if you try to build that without results, then it's always a question mark whether or not this is the correct way to go. So, for example, if you have a team that just never plays tournaments, but they practice for a year, or you have a team that played tournaments for a year but never practiced, the team that played tournaments for a year with never no practice would probably be more comfortable making comebacks and being confident in their non-existent system per se,
mhm.
just because they might have results to back it.
What was losing like?
Kind of felt like the end of the world. At least for me, I put the pressure on myself because I put a time limit on myself. So a little bit of backstory. I gave myself a gap year once I graduated college to go pro in Valorant. So that's kind of when I doubled down and I made the team and all that stuff. So every loss kind of felt like I was not really making it,
Mhm.
especially once the timeline got closer. After 6 months, I was like, oh my God, it's been 6 months and we're still losing to newly formed rosters and all that stuff. So it was very easy to get into my own head and kind of question whether or not this is where I'm supposed to be progress wise, or whether or not I'm not making progress, or maybe I'm overthinking it. So the mental game, I think, with every loss kind of got worse and worse to the point where I eventually just quit.
How do you think a team can prepare itself to better handle the ups and downs of wins and losses?
Kind of take it map by map and really focus on making incremental progress rather than looking at the results of a tournament. Like in this map, did our retakes get better? Yes. Okay, good. Now we got to figure out X, Y, and Z rather than like, oh my God, we got 13-7 by Mickey Mouse team or something.
Mhm.
And like
Mhm.
everything is bad. When in
Mhm.
reality, like maybe your retakes were good and your rotates were good, but like you're just missing bits and pieces there.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I first got into like hockey analytics. I remember I was so disillusioned because sometimes people would be like, "Oh, this team lost because the other team wanted it more." And I'm like, "That doesn't sound reasonable. If you've dedicated your entire life to become a professional hockey player, I can guarantee that everyone wants it." And so sometimes it's just like luck.
Hmm.
Or sometimes it's like I think there was like a world's game in League where it was determined by like a minion body blocked a skill shot that otherwise would have hit. And it's like there is variance, right? And sometimes I would imagine that if a team only wins because it wins a whole bunch of clutches, that's going to be hard to repeat,
100%. Yeah.
especially with the way the economy goes in Valorant. I think a lot of people when they think about like going into like competitive Valorant, there's this like aura around it that you're like, "Oh, if I do that, I'll be like living the dream. I'll be like making going after a living playing video games." What was it like for you to live the life of competing in Valorant?
But I think to answer this question, I kind of need to go back to when I was competing in Fortnite because I was a little bit more successful financially in Fortnite. And any player can kind of make it in Fortnite just because you have to place in tournaments. So to answer the question of what is it like to live the life of, I would say, professional video gamer. It's not really that lavish. You're just spending all day playing the game and you're trying to get better. And every single, I guess, loss or mistake you're trying to critique, and it's very mentally draining. So that's number one. Very mentally draining. You're like have an unbalanced lifestyle. Number two, if you're not actually on like a salaried organization, or even if
Mhm.
you are, they can cut it, just right there. I remember players were getting dropped left and right. So you never really feel secure. You always feel like you
Mhm.
have to live up to it. So that's how it was in Fortnite specifically.
Sounds like
And
the Hunger Games.
yes, it's like every man for himself type of thing. And in Valorant, I think it's even worse because the entire time I was competing, we weren't really even making money. If
Mhm.
anything, we were going in the red. Like tournaments, prize pools that we did win would end up paying off tournament fees. So you're not getting anything. And you're putting in all this time. So, you'd probably, if you didn't have money saved up, you'd probably have to go get a part time job. Or you would also have to be working a job, which some of our players were working jobs. So you're losing time
That sounds
there.
crazy.
So you just don't have time. That's what it feels like. You just don't have time. And for the players that did have time, you weren't really sure how best to allocate it if you're missing teammates.
It sounds like a complete grind.
Yes, like 24/7. That's how it feels.
So why would anyone choose it?
Because they hear, oh my God, I can play video games for a living. And they're like, oh, that's sick. Or they watch like tournaments and I want to be that player. And if you're going to go down that path, you have to understand what it's like or like what it entails. Otherwise, you're not going to make it like me.
I feel like most people think of going into like competitive esports, like winning the lottery,
Hmm.
but it sounds like it's more like trying to get to the Olympics one day. And more often than not, you're not going to make it to the Olympics.
Right.
And you're going to train a lot before you're going to know what the answer is.
Mhm.
Do you think there is, we were talking, it sounds like a complete grind. Do you think there is a way for a player to pursue competitive Valorant and for it not to be this, like, at least what you're like explaining, like this, like soul sucking mountain?
I think so. I think you have to have like the right culture mindset before you even start. I know with Elige, for example, in CS, he was very efficient with his time. I don't think he really went through the grind. I believe he practiced like 5 to 6 hours a day, and that was it. So that's less than a full time job. And he's, of course, one of NA's best. I don't know
Mhm.
if he's still doing that, or maybe I'm misremembering, but um, he was, I would say, the ideal player to look at for that.
Mhm.
And then on top of that, you kind of need to get your teammates and your team culture as a whole to kind of embrace that efficiency. Like we're not wasting time here. We're doing this, this, and this. And then, if you want to do extra time in after practice, then you can do that and bring it to practice rather than trying to address it like waste practice time.
Mhm.
So I think it is doable, but it's not easy.
Cool. Well, thanks for taking the time, Adam. I'm thankful that we were able to talk through what the competitive lifestyle is like. So, what would be your closing words for if someone wants to consider pursuing this as a career?
Well, take it from me. Don't just grind the game. Get your name out there, either posting on YouTube or Twitter, and work on your social skills too, because that plays a bigger part in a team environment than your skills do. If you're not willing to make sacrifices or understand where your teammate's perspective is coming from, you're just going to get cut and you're not going to make it very far.
It's something actually I talk a lot about when I was mentoring people in my past corporate life. Is a lot of people think it's like all about like objectively how good I am, not realizing that you're working in a world with people. And so if you're a complete jerk, that means every time, even if you are amazing, there's just like there's more friction to anyone ever wanting to help you.
Hmm.
Whereas if you're actually someone that people like, life is a lot easier, and your talent, if you do have it, is easier to recognize. So totally aligned with that. Well, that's a wrap then. Thanks everyone for tuning into the first episode of This Valorant Life. And we're
Thanks,
signing off.
everyone.